An old man found this girl with a huge belly, and when doctors looked at her at the hospital, they discovered something terrible. After hearing pitiful screams, an old man looked out the window in surprise and found this unconscious little girl. When he brought her to the hospital, the doctors and nurses were stunned with shock. None of them had ever seen anything so terrible, and tears immediately welled up in the eyes of everyone present. The old man had been looking out the window of his lonely home, as he did every morning when he suddenly heard bitter cries of pain, and shortly thereafter discovered a still very small girl just a few feet away. The squirming and wailing child had a conspicuously distended, fat, and protruding belly, which was the cause of her wails. He quickly put on his jacket, rushed to the girl, gently lifted her, and drove with her as quickly as possible to the nearest hospital. In the now already busy emergency room, the staff immediately realized that the girl was in very bad shape, and in no time at all, the doctors were informed about the emergency and the operating room was prepared. During the procedure that followed, even the extremely experienced chief physician was overcome by his emotions and began to cry. In 1986, the terrible news of a serious accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant shook the world. In a very short time, headlines about the accident caused a lot of anxiety and great concern around the planet. But of course, the disaster was the worst of all for the people directly affected on the ground, who lost their homes from one moment to the next and, faced with death and destruction, fled almost entirely in haste. Among the few who stayed was Fabrizio, whose family had lived in the familiar area for generations and who had no one else to stay with. Despite the bleak situation, he tried to help his relatives and neighbors who had also stayed in their homes and to rebuild his life as best he could. But after 5 long years, even the last of relatives had died from the severe consequences of radioactive radiation. Sad and with a heavy heart, Fabrizio finally talked to his wife, Paola, and together they decided to leave the city and the country forever. Paola's pregnancy was the main reason for this decision. The parents-to-be did not want to expose their child to a hopeless life in the apocalypse, but wanted to offer it a good future. After the birth of Mariana, they emigrated, began their great journey, emigrated to the USA, and dreamed of a new beginning as a small family far away. The high cost for the flights had been financed by Paola's father, who was condemned to death in the Chernobyl hospital and whom they said a desperate goodbye on the last day before their departure. For a while, sad letters from Paola's father continued to arrive from the old country, but at some point, there was a definitive silence, and the young parents feared that he too had died. The agonizing uncertainty almost ate Paola up, but as a mother, she had to pull herself together and take care of her sweet daughter, who could at least elicit a smile from her from time to time. But all the experiences of flight, death, grief, and an unfamiliar new world in which she struggled to find her feet eventually took their toll, and Paola became seriously ill. Fabrizio, as an immigrant without sufficient language skills, earned little money, and soon he could no longer afford the high hospital cost for his wife. Paola's health deteriorated rapidly, and after a month in his loving care at home, she died in his arms. Now Fabrizio and his little daughter were suddenly completely alone and on their own in a foreign country. But he had no time to complain because little Mariana was already 1 year old and needed a lot of attention and care, which is why he now had to work twice as hard. The care in the daycare center was expensive, but it worked pretty well, so Fabrizio's life was slowly getting better again, despite the hard blows of fate. In his sparse free time on the weekends, he lovingly cared for his daughter and took her on many trips to the surrounding area. But the trials were not to end for him yet. One day he was called by his boss, who told him that the kindergarten had called because Mariana was complaining of a terrible abdominal pain and he should go to her immediately. Without waiting, Fabrizio rushed with Mariana to the nearest medical center to have his daughter thoroughly examined, but were turned away because his father did not have health insurance and also did not have enough money for the examination. With the courage of desperation, Fabrizio tried to get help for Mariana, but all government agencies refused and only recommended that he give his daughter up for adoption so that she could have a better life somewhere else. There was no way he was going to accept that because after everything he had already experienced and survived, there was no way he was going to give up now. So he decided to go home with the sick little girl and worked day and night to somehow pay for Mariana's necessary treatment. But soon his daughter's condition worsened alarmingly. Her belly became very distended and she could hardly eat. Fabrizio was in agony because he had to leave the house early every morning and stay at work until late at night, while Mariana stayed at home all alone without help or company, but in great pain. Although from time to time the neighbors helped out and visited the suffering child, the neighborhood was very poor, and everyone had their problems and no time to take care of a little sick girl. Mariana's pain from the tumor in her belly was getting worse every day, and her cries could be heard louder and louder through the surrounding alleys and streets. At first, the residents wanted to complain about the constant whining, but nobody dared to talk to Fabrizio personally. There was already a lot of gossip behind his back, and the father could feel nasty looks when he came home late at night completely overworked. But not all the neighbors were so indifferent, cold, and heartless. An old man who had moved into a house diagonally across the street from Fabrizio only a few days ago heard the girl's cries one morning when he looked out the window. Don Roberto, as the gray-haired but affectionate old man's name was, after a moment's hesitation entered the property across the street and saw to his astonishment that the little girl had fallen and was now lying helplessly on the floor. Without thinking much, he took the trembling bundle in his strong arms, brought her to his car, and drove the fastest way to the nearest hospital, under the astonished looks of the rest of the neighbors. When Fabrizio came home at night, he cried out in horror because he could not find his daughter anywhere. In desperation, he asked the neighbors, who told him about the old man and his ride with Mariana that morning. As fast as he could, Fabrizio ran the 2 or 3 kilometers on foot to the emergency room, where he could hardly believe his deathly tired eyes when he saw his father-in-law, who had long been thought dead, sitting in the waiting area. Both men stopped in front of each other as if rooted to the spot, started sobbing, and finally fell into each other's arms. The old man quickly learned that the little girl he had helped this morning was his granddaughter, whereupon he burst into tears. Sobbing, he told Fabrizio that years ago he had fallen into a coma because of his illness and had been transferred without consciousness to a hospital far away. Unfortunately, the nurses had lost all his personal belongings, so he no longer had any address for his daughter Paula and her husband Fabrizio, and was unable to contact them when he woke up. With difficulty, he had saved penny after penny for the expensive trip to the USA, and after his arrival there, he immediately had gone to the city from which the last letters of his daughter had come. The old man could already see from his son-in-law's sad eyes that Paula was no longer alive, and again the 2 weeping men fell into each other's arms to comfort each other. When they were finally able to stop crying, Don Roberto immediately told them everything new from the old country, and Fabrizio listened with amazement and increased interest. For the old man, during his stays in various clinics, had seen many children with the same symptoms from which his granddaughter was now suffering so terribly. It was the radiation sickness caused by the Chernobyl reactor disaster at that time. Thanks to a new and well-funded United Nations health program, all survivors and sick victims were recently entitled to free treatment in the United States. Just an hour later, little Mariana was admitted to the operating room and underwent surgery. During the operation, however, the surgeons discovered that the radioactive radiation had severely affected the uterus and damaged other organs as well. Although they were able to save Mariana's life, she would never be able to have children of her own. At first, Fabrizio reproached himself for not leaving the dangerous place earlier and passing on his damaged genetic material to his little daughter. But his father-in-law comforted him patiently, lovingly, and gently. With the wisdom of old age, Don Roberto explained that even in misfortune, one must see the good. At least now, they would finally be together again as a family, and Paula would be watching them from beyond and thus help them spiritually. People all over the world are still suffering from the Chernobyl power plant accident in 1986. We should think of their heavy fate if we complain about our supposedly big problems in our everyday lives, which are nevertheless clearly less significant in retrospect and in comparison. Have you heard of such dramatic incidents in your environment or even experienced them yourself in your family? Do you know people affected by radiation sickness who bear their hard lot without constantly complaining and losing courage? I'd be very happy if you would tell us about your experiences here, as I'm curious to know.